This is breaking news and we're giving it to you as we get it.
The body of a young woman is recovered from a brook in the countryside just outside Ipswich.
The inquiry went from 0 to 60 in such a short period of time.
The residential area felt as though it was in lockdown.
If I sat there worrying about the danger every day, I wouldn't be going out to work. I wouldn't be earning my money.
The general opinion was that we were dealing with a serial killer.
Suffolk in 2006 was one of the lowest crime rates in the country. One of the unusual things about Ipswich was it has suffered with on-street prostitution for a long number of years.
Ipswich is a fairly large town. It has everything that any busy town would have. It has a football ground, a large mainline railway station, has a nice waterfront area. It's a population ranging between 120 and 130,000 people. So it's a fairly large town, and what goes with that is reasonable levels of criminality, crime that you would expect, no more, no less, and obviously from a policing perspective it had its challenges.
There's always been prostitution in Ipswich, going back to the 1960s. Initially it started off around the port area, and then it moved to a more sort of commercial area, and then later on, and more recently, it moved into a residential area.
As it changed over the decades, certainly into the 80s, it was a lot more organised. Ongoing police activity had perhaps displaced the issue. It moved from the dock area of Ipswich to the sort of football ground, and women were being sort of brought into Ipswich from other areas, particularly Nottingham and Norwich. Women were brought in by pimps.
It wouldn't go so far as to say a blind eye was turned, but it wasn't one of the priorities of the town itself, although obviously from time to time residents did become fed up of having the girls on the streets and the problems that was causing for residents and their wives and daughters when they were going about their daily business.
Women couldn't go out for fear of being accosted by curb crawlers. So for many years their lives were blighted.
In 2006, between 30 and 40 women in Ipswich are regularly resorting to prostitution as a way of earning money, primarily to fund their drug habits.
I was kind of bullied as a teenager in school and was placed in local authority care at 14. There were no boundaries and no consequences for my actions being in care. You know, obviously there's no one to discipline me and punish me. So yeah, I could pretty much do what I wanted when I wanted, really. I was kind of experimenting with cannabis. I tried heroin and cocaine as well. Other things, I was drinking.
Jade's use of drugs soon turns into an addiction, and she finds herself increasingly in need of money. As a last resort, she turns to prostitution.
I was using drugs in the first place to block how I was thinking and feeling. Was working on the streets because I tried stealing. I was rubbish at that. The easiest thing I had was my body. It was my choice. It's emotional. You do feel degraded and used, so like I was just using the heroin because it's a little bit stronger. I've got my emotions from being a teenager and growing up, but now I've got all these emotions and feelings from sleeping with Tom, Dick and Harry and being disappointed with myself.
A seemingly lone voice in Ipswich, one charity spends time on the streets trying to reduce the harm these women face by supplying condoms, clean needles and advice on how they can try and escape their volatile and often dangerous lifestyles.
iSenior was started in 1998 with a view to looking at addiction, specifically drug addiction, and trying a new approach towards tackling it, i.e. a more holistic approach, which means looking at what's underpinning the addiction, not just dealing with the symptoms, and treating the person as a whole.
If I sat there worrying about the danger every day, I wouldn't be going out to work. I wouldn't be earning my money. So the danger, unfortunately, even though we know it's there, has to take a back seat to the addiction.
On the 31st of October 2006, the fears often blocked out by these young women on the streets of Ipswich turned into a dark reality when 19-year-old Tanya Nicol is reported missing.
I became aware that there was a young woman who'd been reported missing in Ipswich. The young woman said she was going to go into town to see some friends, she was going to go on the bus, and she never turned up the next morning.
Because Tanya was known to services, it was known that she'd gone missing quite quickly, and so that caused some questions to be asked and people to start to wonder what had happened to her.
19-year-old Tanya Nicol shared a home with her mother and younger brother. Her family tell the police that they have no idea that Tanya worked in the sex industry until she went missing.
The officer trying to find Tanya found that she did arrive in town. Later on they found some CCTV from the area, and they found that Tanya was in the area of Hamford Road. And that was one of the last sort of sightings of her. That was 11 o'clock on the 30th of October.
It became obvious within a couple of days that the police were very concerned about her. So at that point, we started trying to get on board in terms of printing posters, saying, have you seen her, to put in shop windows, and obviously try and sort of garner the public to come forward if they'd seen anything. We continually asked the police if there was any developments. We continually asked what we could do to try and keep that profile reasonably high, as I'm sure other media probably did. I think the crux came when Gemma went missing.
Gemma was a young lady born and brought up in Ipswich, as was Tanya. Left school, and I think she wanted to become a beautician.
She got a job at an insurance company call centre, and at one point seemed like any other normal young woman.
But she got involved with a boyfriend and into drugs.
That seemed to then get a hold and get a grip on her. She lost her job, she was with her boyfriend, they had no money, and the only way it would seem that they could get enough money to fund their habits was basically for Gemma to go onto the streets.
Her boyfriend was aware that Tanya was also missing, and he became so concerned he reported her missing.
Well, I started to get worried because she wasn't replying to my text messages, and Gemma always replies to me and she didn't.
Suffolk Constabulary alert the public about their concerns over the sudden disappearance of 25-year-old Gemma Adams.
In Suffolk, because it's a low crime area, we generally know what's unusual, and to have two young women go missing working in the sex industry is unusual. That's why we were on the front foot and detectives were deployed quite early on to try and find these young women.
We were concerned, but we thought, yes, the nature of the work, these people will turn up in a couple of days, they've been away with a punt or something, which wasn't unheard of in the past. So it was just a case of waiting and hopefully they'd turn up safe and sound.
Tragically, the community's hopes were dashed when the authorities made a terrible discovery.
Unfortunately, on the 2nd of December, a water bailiff who was responsible for the Belstead Brook River saw what he believed was the body of a white naked female.
My editor was convinced at the time this was one of the two girls.
A post-mortem examination was then conducted the next day, and it was during this examination that we were able to identify that this was indeed Gemma Adams.
It's tough to know someone that you know quite well, who's a smart, intelligent young lady that just so happens upon drugs, is now not there anymore. Knocks you for six and really makes you worry about Tanya's safety.
From the outset, it was very obvious, once the body was found, that Gemma had been murdered. There is this growing fear now that having found one of the women's bodies, the thought was obviously going through everyone's mind that the likelihood was they may not be finding Tanya alive.
When bodies are found in rivers, it's very difficult as an investigator to obtain evidence, because water, by its very nature, does tend to destroy a lot of evidence. So you need to make sure you use the right sort of experts to get best advice and to, despite them being found in the water, to still try and obtain some evidence to identify who's responsible and how the victim has died.
Her body had been deposited in a fast-flowing river for a number of weeks. The rate of flow of the river and the mere fact she'd been immersed in it meant there was virtually no possibility or potential for recovery of any evidence that might be helpful to the investigative team.
Just 6 days after Gemma's body is found, police make yet another grim discovery.
On the 8th of December, a dive team started to search the Belstead Brook River. On the side of the river going down towards the River Orwell, the body of another young woman was found.
Discreetly shielded by a line of police officers in their vehicles, the body of a young woman is recovered from a brook in the countryside just outside Ipswich.
We got a call to say that a body had been found, and police were down in a place called Cobdock, which is further downstream from the brook that Gemma was found in, and immediately you think it's Tanya.
The body was taken out of the water, and it was when the body was taken back to the mortuary and examination started, we were able to identify this, unfortunately, was in fact Tanya Nicol.
The town then started to become extraordinarily concerned about what was going on, and particularly females, because there was somebody out there who seemed to be abducting women and murdering them. And this was starting to become out of control, and people were wondering where it would all end. It's a small town. A lot of people know each other. Both the women were from this town and had families in this town and friends in this town. A lot of people knew them, so it was quite a shock.
We were giving out general community safety messages. There was a mobile police station in the centre of Ipswich. Personal attack alarms were given out.
There was some national media interest, of course, when 2 bodies are found of young women in a relatively short period of time, in a relatively small area.
On the 10th of December, the investigation took an even darker turn when a 3rd body was found in woodland to the southeast of Ipswich.
A member of the public was a passenger in a vehicle driving down the street in Nacton when they see in the woods what they believe is a mannequin.
The discovery of this young woman's body is very different from that of Tanya Nicol and Gemma Adams. She'd been found on dry land, but worse, she'd been posed naked in a crucifix position. Hers is the 3rd body to be found in just 8 days.
She'd been subjected to rather extreme weather conditions. It was extremely heavy rain at the time, high winds, and she'd been exposed to the elements, making the recovery of any potential evidence very, very difficult and problematic.
It became evident early on that this was another working girl, and as it turned out, it was Annalie Alderton.
The discovery of the body of a 3rd young woman in just over a week is devastating for the community. She is identified as 24-year-old Annalie Alderton. She led a chaotic lifestyle, addicted to heroin, and was irregular on the streets of Ipswich. Tragically, a post-mortem revealed that she was 3 months pregnant.
That's one that did emotionally hit me for 6, because this was a girl that, I grew up in a children's home with, when I was a teenager. So to have someone you've been that close with, growing up with, kind of takes it out of you, and that's when you get the realisation that there's now 3 girls. How many more is there going to be? What's going on here? Who is it?
CCTV images capture Annalie Alderton's last known movements as she arrives into Ipswich by train just days before she was found dead.
So we knew she was in the red light area on the 3rd of December. That night I remember speaking to other officers, and we were speculating, what are we in the middle of here? What's happening? I mean, we only have 7 murders on average a year. Now we've got 3 young women who are involved in the sex industry found dead.
With 3 separate murder cases and Suffolk's biggest manhunt underway, the police are left with no option but to bring in help from other forces across the UK.
Suffolk at that time had a force of about 1,300 officers, but we still needed more officers, because it's not just the detectives, it's all the other ancillary investigations one has to do.
Can I just ask you if you've anything known this girl?
The house-to-house, the searching, the CCTV retrieval, staffing of the incident rooms. These investigations, even singly, take a huge amount of resources.
The residential area felt as though it was in lockdown, to be honest. Nobody could really move without going past a police car.
You could tell that there weren't as many people on the streets, particularly women, after nightfall, and there was this palpable feeling of anxiety and fear and concern over what might happen next.
From that Sunday evening, satellite vans, reporters from all the various news organisations all started to arrive in Suffolk and started to camp out on the various cordons at Nacton.
The media was still keen to speak to people who were going out on the streets to work and the girls that were going out there, obviously driven by their lifestyle, driven by the craving for drugs. And a few of the girls still carried on going out to work the streets.
One young woman who works on the streets and goes by the name of Kelly gives an interview to a news reporter where she reveals the reasons why, despite the fact a killer is on the loose, she is so desperate for money that she can't stop working.
Why have you decided to come out tonight?
Because I need the money. I need the money, you know.
Despite the dangers?
Well, that has made me a bit wary about getting into cars. You just don't know, it could be anyone.
This interview, when I saw it, was quite disturbing. It just showed in stark reality about how vulnerable these young women were, why they were doing it. They weren't doing it out of choice, they were doing it because of their circumstances, because they perhaps didn't have anywhere to live, they'd got no money.
We all had an addiction to feed and no way to do it. That's the reason why we're out there. There may be many different reasons why we started working out there, but we were all out there to fund our drug addiction.
To try and help the women so that they didn't feel that they had to go out on the street, the drug and alcohol services were open in the evenings and at weekends. People were being fast-tracked into those services so that they could get methadone prescriptions rather than having to go out on the streets.
The need was there, the girls were there, you know, danger or not. You know, of course you think about the danger and you wonder whether is that the man that's like killing my friends.
The teams I was supporting and managing were working really hard to try and protect the individuals, the women. And so when we heard that another person had gone missing, it was devastating.
The latest young woman to disappear from the streets is 24-year-old Paula Clennell.
Paula was a young woman who we believed had a serious drug habit, had been working in the sex industry for a while.
She was pretty much, I think, a woman like me. I'm kind of like a tough nut tomboy with a bit of hyperactivity in me, really. Yeah, she was a good mum, genuinely nice girl.
Paula was like many people with an addiction, would dip in and out of treatment. I saw her on the Monday, made an appointment for her on the Thursday, I think it was, but she didn't make that appointment.
A member of the public, a gentleman who just dropped his car off at Nacton, when he looks to his right and sees in the foliage the body of a white, naked female. And this place is only half a mile from where Anna Lee was found in Nacton.
Only 48 hours after Anna Lee is found, and just 700 yards from where her body has been discovered, investigators are now stunned to hear that a fourth young woman is dead.
The inquiry went from 0 to 60 in such a short period of time. Police sent the helicopter up to look over the land, and suddenly, to their surprise, they saw another body in the undergrowth in a different place from where they had been told that a body had been seen. And they suddenly realised there was not one, but two bodies.
This horrifying discovery means the number of women found murdered in the Ipswich area has risen to 5, all in the space of just 10 days.
At 3:48 p.m, a crew member on board the helicopter spotted what appeared to be a second body, a few hundred yards away from the site of the first body.
The speed of the developments, I can remember being at police headquarters for a meeting and then people disappearing out of the meeting and then thinking, well, what's happening? And then somebody coming in saying there's been another body found, and just the shock on everybody's faces was just horrendous.
As you will understand, we don't have a great deal of information. As the Chief Constable has just indicated, this is breaking news and we're giving it to you as we get it.
I mean, this was starting to become out of control, and people were wondering where it would all end.
The two young women are formally identified as 24-year-old Paula Clennell and 29-year-old Annette Nichols. Annette had been missing for 8 days, but Paula Clennell's disappearance had only been reported 2 days before, on the 10th of December. It is then revealed that she was the young woman who had given the television interview under the name of Kelly just days before. Now she's the latest victim of the so-called Suffolk Strangler. The sheer speed and scale of how the investigation unfolds is unlike anything the country has seen before. Whilst huge efforts go into the ongoing investigations, pressure mounts on the forensic teams to determine whether the latest discoveries offer any new clues as to the identity of whoever is responsible for the vicious killings.
After the fifth young woman had been discovered, all the materials recovered from the crime scene were submitted to the laboratory for analysis. The laboratory was under intense pressure to try and analyse material, particularly DNA, in order to identify who may have been in contact with these women around the time of their death. For the first time, we really had the potential to identify the perpetrator of these crimes.
Whilst inquiries continue at a pace into all 5 murders, one man's name keeps coming to the fore.
Publicity had come out at a weekend in a Sunday newspaper. The man had given an interview and he said that he knew all the girls. He was sure that the police would be coming to question him. He was surprised he hadn't been arrested.
This person had contacted the local newsroom and explained that he knew each of the women and felt there'd be material from himself on the women and he had no alibi for this.
He put himself in a position where police were left with no alternative but to take him in and question him.
The man who had deliberately put himself in the spotlight was local supermarket worker Tom Stevens.
I think police believed they'd got their man and they were awaiting a DNA hit to come back from the laboratory.
The investigative team at the laboratory worked all through the night to obtain a DNA profile, in fact, various DNA profiles from each of the women. And these were all found to match a single male who was identified as being present on the national DNA database.
And when it came back, they were shocked and surprised to find out it was someone different.
And when rumours of a new suspect began to circulate, there was panic on the streets of Ipswich's red light district.
It was a huge shock. Clearly they trusted him and carried on seeing him.
It was disgusting, you know, and awful to know that, like, that man touched me.
Annette was said to be quite a soft character. She was said to be the sort of person that would be everyone's friend. You know, people were drawn to her.
Again, a local young woman born and brought up in Ipswich and had a family and had her own problems domestically as well.
Annette was probably one of the most beautiful women I've ever had the privilege to know in my life. She always did everything with a smile on her face. She was polite, well-mannered, intelligent, pretty, you know. She had this way of making you feel that you weren't a working girl or you weren't a drug addict, you know, you were Jade.
On Monday the 18th of December 2006, Suffolk Constabulary makes a significant arrest. A local supermarket worker called Tom Stevens makes himself a suspect by giving a national newspaper a revealing interview into his connection to the dead women. But as forensic investigators work overtime in the hope of confirming the killer's true identity, they have a breakthrough in the form of a DNA sample which matches a profile on the national DNA database. To everyone's surprise, the hit does not match the DNA of Tom Stevens, but instead leads them to a 48-year-old forklift truck driver called Stephen Wright.
This was a big moment for us. Positive evidence that Stephen Wright had some contact with the bodies.
For Jade, the shock of Stephen Wright's arrest was exacerbated by the sickening realisation that she'd actually met him before.
It turns out that Steve Wright was my first ever client, the first ever night I'm out, and my first ever caution was Steve Wright. It was disgusting, you know, and awful to know that, like, that man touched me.
just because somebody's DNA is on somebody's body, there may be an innocent explanation. One has to find these things out. So it was decided he would be made a suspect and he would be arrested on the 19th of December.
Steve Wright arrived in the back of a police custody van, a panel on the side window hiding him from view.
As detectives set about compiling a case against Stephen Wright, the press clamour for more details about the alleged killer.
Steve Wright was born into a military family. First job was in the catering industry, working in a pub or a hotel. He then subsequently went on to do various jobs, including working on cruise ships, and at one point worked on the QE2. He married twice. The first marriage didn't work out, and neither did the second marriage. He went into the pub trade and worked in pubs, ironically in the red light area in Norwich. He had a lot of interests, one of which was spending money. He couldn't hold on to money. It just went through his hands like water. He had gambling debts. At one point he was bankrupt. And in 2003, I think he was working in a Felixstowe bar, and he stole £80 from the till. And he was arrested, charged and convicted. And obviously his DNA was taken.
It's discovered that Stephen Wright had been living in a flat on London Road, right in the heart of Ipswich's red light district.
When it was known that it was Steve Wright who lived in the residential area, who was well known to those individuals who he tragically murdered, it was a huge shock. Clearly they trusted him and carried on seeing him.
He was taken to a police station in Suffolk where he was interviewed by specially trained officers with a solicitor present. We monitored these interviews. He was interviewed over a day and a half, nearly 2 days, and he managed to say no comment to all of the interviews. He made no statement whatsoever.
We've got the last girl to go missing with your DNA and the one before with your DNA. Both on their naked bodies. How can that be? No comment.
On the 21st of December 2006, just 3 weeks after the discovery of Gemma Adams, Stephen Wright is charged with the murders of all 5 women.
After Steve Wright was charged, ordinary members of the public might think that's the end of the matter then, but we then have to prepare for a trial. And with this investigation being so large, 5 murders, so many people involved, so many statements taken. I mean, in an example, there was over 6,000 statements taken. Thousands and thousands of documents which all have to be looked through, assessed, and you have to decide what's going to be evidence and what isn't going to be evidence.
Despite 13,000 calls made by the public, there were no apparent witnesses to any of the 5 disappearances from the streets. So detectives turned to the town's CCTV cameras and a staggering 11,000 hours worth of footage. What this revealed was that at 1:39 a.m. on October the 31st, an automatic number plate recognition camera captured Stephen Wright's blue Ford Mondeo as it drove out of Ipswich along London Road. The camera also caught Stephen Wright behind the wheel, wearing a reflective jacket. Detectives are sure he was on his way to Copdock to hide the body of Tanya Nicol. A short time earlier, the same car was picked up on CCTV, cruising the red light district. Footage also shows Tanya Nicol getting into a car that resembles a blue Ford Mondeo. On the 3rd of December, the same night 24-year-old Annalie Alderton was reported missing, the blue Ford Mondeo was seen again in the red light district near the football ground. In the early hours of the following day, Stephen Wright's car is seen heading in the direction of Nacton, the very area where Annalie's body was later found. Along with the crucial CCTV footage, investigators also hope that forensic evidence could be the key to proving they had linked the right man to the gruesome killings.
We were able to give the police a list of possible garments that may be sources for the fibres that were found in each of these women. These were taken back to the laboratory, and in fact, matches were confirmed with a number of Steve Wright's garments. In particular, fake fur fibres made from wood-acrylic fibres, matching fibres found on Annette Nichols's body, were found in Steve Wright's car and on the inside sleeve of his high-vis jacket. In addition, whilst Steve Wright's car was being examined for the presence of any fibres, it was noticed that small flakes of blood were found from debris recovered from the back seat of his vehicle. This blood was found consequently to match the DNA profile of Paula Clennell.
The detectives need to know whether or not the deaths of Tanya Nicol and Gemma Adams were related to the other 3 murders.
The reason the decision was taken to examine the hair was that hair acts a bit like a mop, as it tends to retain and pick up trace evidence very easily. Despite the long immersion times in the water for both of these women, we found fibres which matched Steve Wright's tracksuit bottoms, and quite crucially, we found a fibre in Tanya's hair which matched the carpet of Steve Wright's car.
The trial begins at Ipswich Crown Court on the 14th of January 2008, where the full horror of Stephen Wright's crimes are put to him. That he abducted the 5 young, vulnerable and trusting women, that he then strangled and stripped them before dumping their bodies in the Suffolk countryside.
Steve Wright, to my surprise, did give evidence at the trial from the witness box. Basically, he said that he'd had consensual sex with 4 of the young women. He had been out using these young women as prostitutes, either in his car or at his home address.
The prosecution were very clever because there was no one smoking gun piece of evidence. It was question after question after question were put to him about all these coincidences, about DNA links, about CCTV cameras seeing his car in various places where the girls had gone missing. All of these pieces of evidence that were put together, you could see his whole defence being picked apart and it just being nobody else but Steve Wright who was the killer of those 5 women.
The thought that he would be found not guilty was unthinkable.
Charged with the murders of Tanya Nicol, Gemma Adams, Annalie Alderton, Paula Clennell and Annette Nichols. Undetected by police for almost 2 months, he stands accused of abusing the trust of these women as he cruised the streets of the red light district looking for his next victim. On the 21st of February 2008, after a 5.5-week trial, the jury reaches a verdict.
We walked to the court when we heard the jury had got a verdict. The thought that he would be found not guilty was unthinkable, because when you bear in mind how big this investigation had been, had we got it wrong, the consequences would have been terrible for the Suffolk Constabulary, the community in Suffolk, most importantly, the families.
Stephen Wright was found guilty of all 5 murders by a unanimous verdict, the judge describing his actions as a targeted campaign of murder. After the guilty verdicts, Stephen Wright is given a whole life term, meaning he'll never be released from jail.
It's quite odd when a big trial finishes, which has reached the national consciousness, because once it's finished and the verdict is brought in and the sentence is handed out, then all of a sudden everything's back to normal again. And the circus, for want of a better phrase, media-wise, moves on elsewhere, and locally, you're still here.
As the dust settled on the case and Ipswich tried to return to normal, the police, the City Council and other agencies started to look at what lessons could be learned from the tragic events of 2006.
This was probably the biggest incident that had affected Ipswich, probably affected Suffolk. The reputation of the town and the county was at stake here. So what were we going to do to make sure this never happened again? And what were we going to do to bring back the reputation of the county and the town?
If there's anything good that came out of this investigation, these terrible circumstances, it was that the constabulary, with other agencies, was then proactive in trying to make sure something like this never happened again.
I think at the time there was a sea change in the way that people viewed women who worked on the streets and worked in the sex industry. Certainly in Ipswich, I think there was.
At that time, I was the superintendent in charge of Ipswich, and I was given the task from the Joint Agency Strategic Group to look at ways in which we could remove prostitution from the streets of Ipswich. We set a strategy that had 5 years to achieve the aim of removing prostitution from Ipswich. It was clearly going to be a hugely challenging target. I'm not sure that anywhere else had done this in the UK, but we wanted to challenge the view that it went on everywhere, didn't happen in every town in England, so why should it continue to occur in Ipswich?
All of the agencies realised that they needed to work together for the sake of those individuals and their families. We had to make a change and do something different and really tackle street prostitution in Ipswich so that we didn't let those women die in vain.
The first task was to determine the number of women actively engaged in sex work throughout the city. Originally, it was thought there were dozens of girls working on the streets, but the police investigation reveals there were more than 100.
These women were incredibly vulnerable across all areas of their life, lived very chaotic lifestyles. We knew that by continually enforcing the law against the women who were working on the streets, that didn't work. So we needed to think very differently.
Walking the streets, obviously, you would get cautioned for soliciting. If you got a certain amount of cautions, you'd then get arrested and fined by the courts. But if I got a fine, you know, that's money I then have to go back out on the streets to earn, you know, and then I could probably get another caution, get another fine.
That was what we now call a revolving door effect, so it was never really effective in dealing with the issue. We wanted to look at each individual woman and look at their needs. Clearly, drug addiction was one of the big things, but equally things such as access to healthcare, access to education, access to housing. All of these things were relevant.
Along with investing their resources into helping the women escape their chaotic lifestyles, the police decide to change their enforcement tactics by coming down heavily on the men who bought sex, instead of prosecuting those who sold it.
We would arrest them, they would be taken to the police station, they would have their fingerprints taken, their DNA taken, their photograph taken, and they would go through the court process if necessary. If they had no previous convictions and they admitted their guilt, they would of course be offered a police caution. And most were happy to accept that, because what we also found was that most of these men were married in long-term relationships. Many of them had children.
After just 2 years, the scheme in Ipswich began to show results. Designed to offer sex workers an alternative to a life on the streets, providing access to healthcare, accommodation and drug rehabilitation. It had a noticeable effect on the area.
There was no demand, there was no arrests because there were no individuals actually operating in that area, because the message had got out very clearly that street prostitution was not taking place, and therefore there was no point in coming to Ipswich.
That's not to say there are still not reports of working girls being out on the streets from time to time, but once those reports are made to the police or the authorities, they're scooped up into this strategy to try and get help and to try and ensure that we never go back to where we were.
Sadly, it will take murders to occur before local areas or cities or towns do something about their prostitution problem. Don't let it be another Ipswich. We can't allow it to happen again before something's done.
Throughout the country, a number of councils have tried various methods to tackle the issue. In Leeds, they've taken what is called the managed approach, which is the first of its kind in the UK, and the closest we've come to decriminalising street prostitution. Working in partnership with the City Council, the police and charities such as Basis Yorkshire, support workers like Emily Turner help sex workers with their safety and well-being.
The managed approach started as a pilot in 2014 in October, and that pilot ran for a year.
Within this designated area, the laws surrounding soliciting and curb crawling are relaxed between the hours of 8 p.m. and 6 a.m, although business is not allowed to take place here.
Before we had the managed approach, women would be all over the place. They would be in the residential area and in the industrial area, which would cause problems with the residents because no one would want to have sex work happening in their backyard or next to where they were living with their children. So since we've had the managed approach, we've moved all of the women away from the residential area into the more industrial area. We know where they are, they're visible, they're not scared of the police, they'll report to the police. We don't inherently see sex work as harmful, Just like we don't see buyers of sex as harmful, it's individuals that are harmful, and that needs to be dealt with by the law.
Women are 18 times more likely to be murdered if they enter the sex industry, and opinions are divided over how best to protect them from danger.
There are clearly very, very strong views around decriminalisation issue, decriminalising women, decriminalising the men. People put a very strong argument to say that that is the only way to make it safe. I think if you continue to allow prostitution, decriminalise all the legislation around it, you will make it a haven for pimps and traffickers to continue to exploit women, to traffic women into a country where the demand is high. You know, we need to turn this around and say, actually, purchasing women for sex is not acceptable, and we need to change the attitude of men about the exploitation of women, and we need to target the demand.
The managed approach isn't all the way there that we want it to be. It has its flaws and it's not perfect. But ultimately, we all want sex workers to be safe. We want to reduce their vulnerability, and we all want perpetrators of serious crimes, trafficking, exploitation, and serious crimes like murder and rape. We all want those people to face justice.
We've proved categorically that you can do something about it. It is hard, it's challenging, you've got to have patience, certainly compassion, certainly one or two local champions and resources in place for it to occur, but it can be done.
I think what this investigation showed was that there was a lot of empathy for those women who found themselves, for whatever reason, working out on the streets of Ipswich. And I think the way the murder investigation was run and the way it was continually being personalised, that these women were always named. You know, they had a life too, and they needed to be treated with dignity and respect.
When I'm doing positive things in my recovery, I look up and I say, there you go, girlies. I talk to them sometimes. And I like to think when I'm doing positive things that they're proud of me. So, like, I'll do stuff like this. I will talk to people. I will make them aware, you know, that I'm a human being too. I'm not just a junkie and a hooker. You know, I'm a person just like everybody else. We're all somebody's daughter, somebody's mother, somebody's sister, niece. I kind of look at them and think about them when I'm doing positive stuff. You know, I don't like to dwell on all the memories and that, you know. I have them in here and that's where they're going to stay.